picking up where we left off, in the previous part of this lesson, we talked about Socrates' discussion of the philosophic education, and culminating in the allegory of the cave, where education is presented as liberation from deep, dark ignorance through the turning of the soul away from the world of the senses toward the intelligible world of the ideas. Now, Socrates applies this image to the education of philosopher kings in the City and Speech. And here I want to read you a passage where Socrates explains it. Socrates says to Glaucon at this point, having finished the image, "Isn't it likely and necessary, as a consequence of what was said before, that those who are without education and experience of truth would never be adequate stewards of a city, nor would those who have been allowed to spend their time in education continuously to the end," that is, those who are only philosophers, "the former," that is, those who are uneducated, "because they don't have any single goal in life at which they must aim in doing everything they do, in private or in public," the idea of the good. "The latter," that is, philosophers who live private lives, "won't be good rulers because they won't be willing to act, believing that they have emigrated to a colony on the Isles of the Blessed while they are still alive." In other words, these philosophers won't want to rule because they're perfectly happy doing what they're doing, pursuing and contemplating the truth. They don't want to have anything to do with politics. And Glaucon says, that's true. And Socrates says, then our job as founders is to compel the best natures to go to the study which we were saying before is the greatest, to compel them to see the good and to go up that ascent. And when they have gone up and seen sufficiently, we are not to permit them what is now permitted. What's that? Glaucon asks. And Socrates says, to remain there and not be willing to go down again among those prisoners, or share their labors and honors, whether they be slighter or more serious. In other words, our job as founders is to compel them to have a philosophic education, and then to turn around and force them to put it to use in governing the community. And Glaucon objects to this, saying, what? Are we to do them an injustice and make them live a worse life when a better one is possible? To which Socrates responds with something similar to his earlier response to Adeimantus. He says, you forget, Glaucon, that the purpose of this philosophic education isn't simply to produce philosophers and then let them do what they want. No, our job as founders is to make a city that is happy as a whole, one that has good rulers, and the philosophic education is necessary for that. So, our job is to compel them to rule for the good of the city. And anyways, he adds, we won't be doing them a great injustice. We'll make this argument to them. Look, you philosophers, in any other political community, you exist against the will of the community. There's nobody in that community that actually cares about philosophy and wants you to be a philosopher. And so you don't owe those communities anything. But in our city, everything has been organized to make your education and your way of life possible. And that means, in a way, you owe us. We've done good things for you, helped you to realize your potential as a philosopher. In return, it's only fair that at least once in a while you take your turn at the helm and be in charge. And Socrates says this is a fair request to make of them, and they will fulfill this request because they're fair-minded. But he notes, they won't do it because they think ruling is something good. They're not like the rulers that Thrasymachus was talking about, that want to be in charge so that they can use their power to seize all sorts of good things. No, the philosophers don't want political power for that reason because they don't care about any of that stuff that tyrants and politicians are after. They don't care about the honors that the city has to offer. They don't care about power. They don't care about bodily pleasures. They don't care about wealth. What they care about is truth. And political power is not going to give you truth. So the way he puts it is, they rule, but they do it because ruling is necessary, not because they think it's good. They don't think that ruling is going to do them any good. It's good for the community. But for them, it's a distraction. It takes them away from what they want to be doing. They just do it because it's fair. And this shows in a way that, the philosophic life and the political life really are utterly different things. Socrates has just said that a philosopher living a private philosophic life lacks absolutely nothing in order to be happy. So ruling is not somehow the natural completion of the philosophic nature. Ruling is a distraction. They don't want to rule because they see that it is not good for them. They are compelled to rule and willing to do so simply because it's fair, not because it's good. And it turns out, funny enough, and this is something that I think a lot of scholars sometimes overlook, this unwillingness to rule is actually one of the chief qualifications that philosophers have for being in charge. Usually when philosopher kings are discussed, the emphasis is on, well, they're the wise ones. They have the knowledge. They're the experts. Therefore, they should be in charge. And that's certainly there. Socrates says, yes, they have the wisdom and they have the virtue. But one of the most important things that makes them the ones that can be trusted with absolute authority is that they are the only ones in the city who don't want it and therefore aren't liable to abuse it. Here's how he puts it. If you discover a life better than ruling for those who are going to rule, it is possible that your well-governed city will come into being. For here alone will the truly rich rule. Rich not in gold, but in those riches required by the happy man. Rich in a good and prudent life. But if beggars, men hungering for lack of private goods, go to public affairs, supposing that in them they must seize the good, it isn't possible. When ruling becomes a thing fought over, such a war, a domestic war, one within the family, destroys these men, themselves, and the rest of the city as well. Right, you see here he's describing Thrasymachus's account of the rulers, like the sailors on the ship of state. People who think that somehow they can get all sorts of good things that they don't already have if only they had the power to take them. When those are the people who fight to be in charge, your city is in bad shape. And that's pretty much every city, according to Socrates. What you need is somebody who's already self-sufficiently happy before he has power, because that's the person who's not going to abuse power. Right? He says, have you any other life that despises political offices other than that of true philosophy? No, by Zeus, I don't, Glaucon says. But men who aren't lovers of ruling must go to it. Of course. And so Socrates concludes, who else will you compel to go to the guarding of the city than the men who are most prudent in those things through which a city is best governed, and who have other honors and a better life than the political life? No one else, Glaucon says. So, there's nothing they could possibly get for themselves out of politics, so they're not tempted by corruption. And so since they also have knowledge, they should be in charge. And something that goes by quickly here, but is worth mentioning, because now he turns to the philosophic curriculum, is the fact that Socrates has actually contradicted himself. You might remember back in Book 5, he had asserted, and Glaucon had agreed, that the life of the guardians, the auxiliary guardians, the warriors, was the best life, more blessed than the life of the Olympic victors. Socrates had said that, and Glaucon agreed. But of course their life was a political life, and they were practical men. Now, with the introduction of philosophy, Now with the introduction of the philosophic perspective upon being and upon the ordinary world in which we live, we see that there is, in fact, a much better life than the political life. That, in fact, the only truly happy life is the life that transcends political concerns, that is, in a certain sense, indifferent to all the things that we can get through politics. The philosophic life, which pursues truth for its own sake, that is truly the best life. And it's only because that's the best life, Socrates says, that philosophers can be trusted with power, because they don't need anything. And Glaucon agrees. So now we see how Socrates has changed the conversation. In Book 5, when he said that the auxiliary guardians lived the best life, that was before philosophy had even been introduced in the dialogue, when he still was allowing Glaucon to think that the virtues of the guardians are genuine virtues, that the way of life of the guardians was the best life, that the just soul was the soul of the guardian, produced through the guardian education. Now Glaucon has moved beyond that, and he sees that there is an even better way of life, that in fact is radically different from the life of the guardians, not just in its virtues, but in its goals. And that's why they have to return again to the discussion of what you could call the philosophic curriculum, the question of how you go about educating a philosopher. We have the image, we need to turn them away from becoming towards being, we have to draw them towards the ideas. But then there's the more practical question of, well, what sorts of studies actually do that? And Glaucon himself says that the previous education that they discussed, the one that before he thought was the finest possible education, the education of the guardians, is totally inadequate for producing philosophers. He says it educated the guardians through habits, transmitting by harmony a certain harmoniousness, not knowledge, and by rhythm a certain rhythmicalness. And connected with it were certain other habits, and speeches fostering those habits, whether they were made up or true. But as for a study directed towards something of the sort you are now seeking, there was nothing of the kind in it. So Glaucon sees now that if the philosophic life is the best way of life, then the previous education they'd gone through is not the finest possible education. But rather we need to look for another one that draws people towards truth and towards intelligibility for its own sake. I'm not going to go through the details of that curriculum. Much of it that he talks about is mathematical in character, ascending from arithmetic to geometry to stereometry to a kind of theoretical physics and music and harmony and things like that. It's mathematical education. Here it's not for its own sake, but basically the idea is that those who have the potential for philosophy must first develop their ability to think abstractly, and so they must engage in progressively more complex abstract thinking. He likens it to a kind of gymnastic training of the mind. But he says, and this is what basically potential philosophers in the city and speech will be doing during their 20s. He says, when they're young, they'll play games, they'll get normal training, they'll do their military service, and those who've shown the greatest intellectual aptitude will at the age of 20 be separated off from everyone else, and will engage in kind of a 10-year study of mathematics. And those who prove themselves most able at that will then, around the age of 30, move on to the proper philosophic education. All the mathematical stuff is what he calls a prelude. The real song, he says, is education in dialectic. All other training was preparation for that. Now remember, we've already talked about what dialectic is. The art or skill of having a conversation, meaning the ability to take opinions about things and cross-examine and investigate those opinions, test them for consistency, test them for false assumptions, test them for bad implications, and work your way to progressively more coherent opinions about things. Work your way to the truth through the investigation of speeches to find the essence or definitions or ideas of things. Right? And this ultimately relies upon the use of reason, not the senses. And math has been preparing them for this. But at the same time, Socrates says, dialectical training must not start until these potential philosophers have reached around the age of 30 because dialectic, unlike mathematics, is dangerous. Dialectic can corrupt young people. Why? Because dialectic undermines the traditional authoritative opinions that people have through cross-examination and refutation. But it doesn't, at least immediately, replace them with anything else other than skepticism. And he gives an image of this. He says, you think about someone, let's say you have what he calls a changeling child, somebody who's raised by a family believing that his adopted parents are his true parents. And he says, won't this son honor his parents, believing that they are his true parents? And won't he obey them and do what they say? Yes. What happens when this son discovers that those people who raised him were not his real parents, that he did not really come from them? Socrates says, such a person will begin to lose respect for his parents, not accept their authority in the same way he did before, and become more willing to ignore what they say and follow the promptings of others, say friends who are trying to draw them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do. In other words, won't such a changeling child become less respectful of authority and more susceptible to corruption when he ceases to believe that his parents are his true parents? This is the image. And he says, a similar thing happens in dialectic. We are from youth onward raised to believe certain things about what is just and what is good and what is honorable. And these opinions, oftentimes embodied in law and given to us by authority figures, these are the authorities that we defer to. They are the authorities that we believe make us who we are. And we defer to them. We try to live up to the standards of our society, what it praises, try to avoid what it blames. Well, what happens when some person comes along practicing dialectic and refutes all these opinions and shows this young person what you thought was just isn't necessarily just, and what you thought was noble isn't necessarily noble, and you don't really know anything, and all these opinions, all these authoritative opinions that you've oriented yourself according to, you don't know if any of them are true. They seem all self-contradictory. What happens to somebody in that state, Socrates says? Well, young people in that state, oftentimes what they'll do, when those authoritative opinions that they've guided themselves by have been undermined, they will give themselves over to hedonism. Not knowing how to orient themselves, not knowing what principles to follow, they will pursue pleasure. Probably because pleasure is one of those things where you don't need to stop and ask yourself whether pleasure is good. Right? Pleasure becomes the obvious good thing to be pursued when you no longer believe that self-restraint and moderation and such things are actually good. So dialectic can corrupt the young. And this is a danger that, in effect, dialectic must court. There's no way to pursue truth for its own sake without cross-examining all opinions. This is an unavoidable danger in the philosophic pursuit. It makes youths lawless, Socrates says. So what you need to do is wait and not expose them to dialectic until they're older, around the age of 30, when they're more set in their ways and they have a more settled character, and you can be more confident that when exposed to this dialectical cross-examination, they won't simply just go wild and become hedonists as a result. They're steadily habituated. And of course, this isn't easy, because as Socrates also notes, people who are very settled and fixed in their ways oftentimes don't have a lot of dialectical aptitude because they're not interested in questioning things. So it's very tough. You have to have a stable, settled character that you can trust, and at the same time, they need to have a fiery intellect that wants to pursue truth for its own sake. And those are two very hard things to put together. Socrates says, though, in our city, we have to find a way to do this. So what he says is that those who prove most able in math will move on to dialectic, and for a number of years they will undergo dialectical training. Not complete. They won't ascend to knowledge of the good. Instead, they'll increase their intellectual powers and engage in dialectic. And then around the age of 35, they'll be taken away from that, and they're going to have to go serve the city for about 15 years. You imagine as sort of administrators and judges and things like that. So they have to do about 15 years of public service. And then once they're past their physical peak and they've reached about the age of 50, then they can return to and complete their dialectical education and ascend to the idea of the good. And then for most of the rest of their lives, they'll just live private lives as philosophers. But every once in a while, they'll be called up to be in charge for a certain period of time. And they'll do it, even though they don't want to, because they recognize that it's fair. For the most part, their lives will be given over to philosophy. And that's the curriculum for the philosophers, or dialectic investigation. What's very strange is that at this point, Socrates then adds a very brief discussion for the last time of how such a city could be possible, where basically what he says is, okay, so once we have philosophers like this, all we need to do to found the city is the following. We just need to convince the parents in a city, right, to hand over all their kids, 10 years of age or younger, to the philosophers, so that the philosophers can mold and educate them. And everybody who's older than 10, since they've already become kind of corrupted by other ways of doing things, everybody who's older than 10 then has to be banished to the countryside. And the philosophers will take all the kids and mold them, and that will form your city. And this would be the easiest way to found your city. Basically, in effect, convince parents to give up the thing that they value more than anything else in the world, hand it over to a philosopher, and go into exile. Not going to happen. Right? This is an impossible founding of a city. And it's impossible or highly unlikely in one other way that's worth mentioning, which is, remember, Socrates had already shown at the end of the discussion of the allegory of the cave that philosophers don't want to be in charge. If they could get out of being in charge, they would. So who's going to force these philosophers to persuade these parents to give their kids away and get lost? The philosophers don't want to persuade anybody to put them in charge. And nobody else wants philosophers to be in charge. So you see, the gap between philosophy and the city remains unbridged. People don't want philosophers to be rulers. Philosophers don't want to rule. That's basically what Socrates has said. So in other words, this city and speech, this best regime, is not going to happen. It's not a genuine possibility. But at this point, and as we'll see later on, it doesn't really bother Glaucon anymore, because his attraction to this city, his desire to bring this city into being, was rooted in his conviction that this city represented the peak of virtue. Now he sees that the best, the most truly excellent human life is the philosophic life, which is necessarily a private life, and also which is a life that is available to people even when they're not in the best regime. Right, so his highest aspirations for happiness, in other words, Glaucon now believes the highest form of excellence can be attained and realized without the need to bring this city into being. So its impossibility no longer truly bothers him. Let me say a few more things by way of conclusion for this lesson. We've seen now that the harmony between philosophy and the city that was initially proposed when Socrates announced the need for philosopher kings does not really exist. People don't want to be ruled by philosophers. Philosophers don't want to rule the people. The best regime, though, nonetheless, is still the best, even if not possible, in the sense that it is the regime, or would be the regime, where everyone does a job for the whole, so everyone serves the good of the whole, and where the whole is governed by an overriding concern for the common good. Right? The rulers rule for the advantage of the weaker, for the advantage of the whole. Each person contributes to the good of the whole. No one can selfishly shirk or be idle or commit profitable injustice or seek power in order to exploit others. This is the city where those things don't happen. But what we have also seen is that a city of this kind, whatever kind of purely political ideal it might be, a city of this kind rests upon a kind of devotion to the common good that is both unnatural, I think, and irrational. In order to live in a city such as this, we must abandon, or be forced to abandon, almost all of our natural attachments, the things that we call our own, and that give most people real meaning to their lives, right? Their family, especially, their work, their daily pursuits, right? Because you can't assume, and Socrates doesn't say it, that most people could be philosophers. So if you build a city such as this, you will end up denying to most people many goods that are the kinds of goods that they're capable of enjoying, and you won't be really replacing it with anything other than security. So it might not be worth it. It's certainly not natural. It seems that there are many aspects of our nature that aren't necessarily bad, but that will be deprived in a city such as this, especially among the guardians, who really have nothing except their service to the city, a city which itself is built on lies. But this kind of devotion is also irrational in the sense that philosophers, who are reason incarnate, the most rational of human beings, would not choose to found and live in a city like this. The philosophers do manage to transcend the love of one's own that characterizes most people and that oftentimes drives them to injustice or to do bad things. The philosophers do transcend those sorts of lower private attachments, but they don't transcend it towards the common good in any political sense. It's not that they deny their private interest for the sake of the good of their human community. Rather, they transcend love of one's own. They transcend the love of these lesser corrupting things through an assent to the contemplation of truth for its own sake, which is not a political goal. And they can do that right where they are. They don't need to found a city. And if they founded this city, it would require them to engage in a lot of distracting political behavior and activity that they don't want to engage in anyways. So the very people who could bring this order devoted to the common good into being would not choose to do so, nor would anybody else want to live in it. So it is the best regime only if you grant that what is best is that everybody be oriented towards the good of the whole. But neither the best human beings nor ordinary human beings can reasonably be expected to believe that the sum total and peak of human life lies in that kind of public devotion. It's not true. In the next lesson, we will return to the conversation that was broken off at the end of Book 4. Socrates will return now that he has finished the founding of the city and found and discovered the nature of the virtue of justice. He will now return to his attempt to prove that it is always better to be just than unjust.